Hello and welcome. I'm Leigh Ann Gerrans and you're watching W News, broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya headquarters. These are our top stories. Trump speaks to Zelensky on the phone as the US president says they are very much on track. It comes as Russia and Ukraine trade air attacks as Putin rejects America's proposal for a 30-day ceasefire. Israel launched a new limited ground invasion in Gaza as hundreds protest on the streets of Jerusalem. And a Louisiana inmate is executed with nitrogen gas despite calls from his attorneys of it being an unconstitutional method. To our top story, and President Trump has spoken to President Zelensky on the phone earlier today. Posting on Truth Social, the US president said the conversation lasted around an hour and centered around his call with President Putin last night. Trump added that things were very much on track. It comes after Russia and Ukraine launched multiple air attacks on one another after Vladimir Putin rejected a proposal from the US regarding a 30-day ceasefire. Ahead of further talks in Saudi Arabia this weekend, the two leaders agreed on a prisoner swap between Russia and Ukraine. Sarah Firth reports.
Not the sound of success, but the familiar overnight air raid sirens ringing out over Ukraine's capital as explosions lit up the night sky. It comes on the back of a phone call between US President Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin, where an immediate ceasefire on all energy and infrastructure for 30 days was agreed. The US president calling the exchange a good and productive one. The Kremlin claiming in their post-phone call statement that Putin immediately gave the Russian military the appropriate order. Ukraine's President Zelensky responding to the call saying Ukraine supports all steps aimed at ending the war.
We are skeptical when it comes to trusting the Russians. There is no trust in Putin. That's why I'm saying we need to understand how it will work technically so that it will not depend on their will alone. That is it.
Many Ukrainians expressing the same skepticism as their president.
I think this will be a step forward to a ceasefire if Russia really stops attacking Ukrainian infrastructure. But to be honest, I hardly believe it will be long-lasting.
For better or worse, Trump and Putin have a history, one that Trump has repeatedly claimed means he is the leader capable of getting a ceasefire deal done. The White House are already claiming the call as a step in the right direction. But with footage released by the Emergency Service of Ukraine appearing to show an attack on a hospital in Sumy overnight, and Ukraine's Zelensky claiming Russian attacks specifically targeted civilian infrastructure and started within hours of the Trump-Putin agreement, it'll be not words on paper, but actions on the ground that count. Sarah Firth, Al Arabiya News, Washington, D.C.
We can now go live to Moscow to speak to our correspondent, Dasha Chernyshova. Dasha, let's return to that phone call between Trump and Zelensky a day after his call with Vladimir Putin, of course. Is that a sign that things are now moving forward?
Absolutely, and that has been the understanding in Moscow as well, because it follows the conversation with the Russian president. Now, we've heard from Donald Trump, President of the United States, that much of that discussion was based on what the American president discussed with the Russian counterpart the day before, and that was an attempt to align the positions of the Ukrainian and Russian side in terms of their needs and their requests. That's according to a post post that Donald Trump posted on his social media platform Truth Social. So in this conversation, definitely Moscow would have been looking for the Ukrainian side for some signals that it would also be listening to the appeal, to the call coming from Moscow to prevent and to halt attacks against the energy infrastructure for the next 30 days.
Dasha, Putin agreed to a pause in targeting energy infrastructures in Ukraine, but the Kremlin denies striking energy infrastructure and is accusing Ukraine. What more can you tell us about what's happening?
That's precisely the accusation from the Russian side. Moscow says it was Kyiv that was not adhering to that principle and saying that there was a deliberate overnight attack by the Ukrainian side against Russian energy facilities. That is particular Kavkazskaya station in Russia's Krasnodar region in the southwest of the country. Meanwhile, what Moscow is saying is that this attack by the Ukrainian side runs counter the efforts that have been put forward by the Russian and American presidents. Meanwhile, Moscow insists that following the conversation between Trump and Putin the day before, the Russian Ministry of Defense has received orders to halt those attacks, and they say that there were drones already in the air that were supposed to target energy facilities of Ukraine in the area of Nikolaev region. But those drones were destroyed by the Russian air defenses in order to make sure that Moscow adheres to this very idea of halting the strikes against energy infrastructure. So definitely this is something that Moscow is closely monitoring, and the perception in Moscow is that if Ukraine manages to align with this, then certainly things will be moving forward much faster.
Further talks are due to take place in Saudi Arabia this weekend. What are we expecting to come out of these discussions?
Well, indeed, the Kremlin has confirmed that in the coming days, the dates for the meetings between Russian and American experts will be defined, and the Americans said that that will be Sunday. So the two presidents, in their second conversation on the phone, they have agreed to start those talks immediately. So now we are expecting the groups of experts from Russia and the United States to start working on the nuances of the peace settlement for Ukraine. The understanding in Moscow is that's going to be a very difficult road ahead, because there are many bridges that have to be built, there are many differences that have to be merged, and those groups will be working on the nuances, first of all, of the ceasefire that Donald Trump has proposed. The Russian president raised many questions about, including policing, control, verification, and many other issues. So those groups will be tasked with the nitty-gritty of how that could be materializing. But also the understanding in Moscow is that those groups will also need to address the root causes of the conflict in Ukraine, and that is obviously for Russia the big red line. Any possible participation of the Ukrainian authorities in any sort of military alliances, and Moscow will be insisting that there have to be some guarantees from all sides to make sure that Russia's national interests are preserved. So this is exactly these kind of negotiations that Moscow is expecting to take place next.
Dasha, Chernyshova in Moscow, thank you for joining me. Let's take a look at some of the other stories making the headlines today. Tensions have escalated between the Trump administration and judges in the US. Chief Justice John Roberts has rejected impeachment calls for judges shortly after President Trump demanded the removal of one who ruled against his deportation plans. In another seeming impasse, a federal judge has blocked the US military from enforcing the president's executive order banning transgender people from military service. The US has launched multiple airstrikes in Yemen, targeting the Houthis. The group has been threatening to attack ships on the Red Sea shipping route after Israel's latest restrictions on Gaza. That's despite US pressure on the Houthis to scale back the attacks. The mayor of Istanbul has been detained as part of a corruption probe days before being named as a presidential candidate. Erkam İmamoğlu from the secular Republican People's Party is among Turkish President Erdogan's strongest political rivals. Authorities have detained 100 suspects as part of the investigation and accuse İmamoğlu of being the leader of a criminal organization. And finally, the world's ugliest fish has now earned the title of Fish of the Year over in New Zealand. The blobfish was crowned by an environmental group. It won the award with nearly 1,300 votes out of 5,500 votes cast. There have been anti-government protests on the streets of Jerusalem today as thousands of demonstrators clashed with police, attempting to break down barricades outside the home of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. They are against the government's plans to fire intelligence chief Ronan Bar and are calling for a hostage deal despite a return to fighting in Gaza. In the last hour, Israel has launched a new limited ground invasion to retake a key corridor in Gaza. According to Gaza's civil defense agency, 13 people were killed in Israeli strikes on the Strip. The health ministry said a strike on a UN building in Deir al-Balah killed one foreign worker and injured 5 others. Israel, however, denied targeting the compound. We can now speak to the former Deputy Mayor of Jerusalem and Foreign Ministry Special Envoy, Fleur Hassan-Nahoum. Fleur, thank you for joining me. Israel has launched new limited ground invasions of Gaza amid deadly bombing, with Gaza's civil defense saying at least 436 people have been killed since Israel resumed strikes. Is this still a case of self-defense for Israel?
Well, let's be accurate here. Gaza civil defense is a very nice euphemism for Hamas terrorists, for jihadi extremists. And so you can't trust anything they say. We've caught, and the whole world has caught them in lies about how many injured and how many dead. And so I think we have to be very careful before we say those numbers and those facts as fact.
I just wanted to bring up something else, Fleur. Gaza's health ministry toll actually shows 970 deaths in the past 2 days. So do you think that these numbers are inaccurate?
Absolutely. We know that from last year's Al-Shifa hospital debacle, where in fact it was a Hamas rocket that landed in its own hospital on its way to be in Israel. And when it was reported to be an Israeli attack, missile attack, there were 500 dead. The minute that it became a Hamas own missile on its own hospital, the dead were 23. So really you can't trust anything coming out from a group of terrorists that are ruling and subjugating its own people and ruling the Gaza Strip.
The UN is also reporting a UN aid worker has been killed in Gaza and 4 others have been seriously injured. I just want to ask you the question again. Is it still a case of self-defense for Israel?
Well, as long as the hostages are there, absolutely. All they have to do is return the hostages. There's 25 hostages alive. The rest we believe are dead. It's almost 60 hostages. And we know that they've been starved. They've been treated very badly. They've been tortured. We know how they came back. You've seen it yourselves on the screens. And so if they want all this to be over, it's very simple. Hand over the hostages. That's all it is.
Let's just touch on that. So families of hostages in Gaza are said to be terrified they won't return after Israel resumed fighting. Has Israel actually given up on bringing their hostages home?
No, absolutely not. What we have learned over the torturous last year and a half in a war we didn't start, in a war we didn't want, Let's remember that Gaza has been under Hamas rule since 2007. They could have turned it into Dubai, they could have turned it into Singapore, and instead they turned it into a proxy of the Iranian regime and used it as a place to launch attacks on Israel. And so this is absolutely what we want is our hostages home. This is a war we didn't want. And it's a war that it turns out the leadership of Gaza, Hamas, don't really care much about their people, because if they did, they'd be negotiating in good faith to help us get our hostages home. And this is what it's about at the moment.
Hamas remains a dominant force in Gaza. There have been previous efforts from both sides to agree on a path to peace. Do you think this can still be achieved from where we are right now?
Yes, I mean, look, ultimately, the military pressure got Hamas the last two times, to sit down and negotiate. And this is what Israel's doing right now. It is only the military pressure. Otherwise, what they're doing with their time in ceasefire is beefing up their terrorist infrastructure to continue attacking Israel. No normal country would put up with this. No normal country would just allow the people who have declared in their charter that their sole aim is to actually destroy the whole country and all the Jews around the world. And so at the moment, the military pressure will create the situation where they will sit down and hopefully negotiate a deal. Even Stephen Witkoff, who is President Trump's envoy here for this situation, has said that the last offer that Hamas offered or wanted or willing to accept was a joke. It was 4 dead people and one live boy for 50 or 100 terrorists in our jails. This is not a serious offer when we have another 25 living hostages, and time is ticking for those hostages, because we know how they've come out. We know that they've all been through a personal Holocaust. We know they're not getting fed, they're being starved, and they've been tortured. And so the time is running out, and Israel can't sit around and wait for Hamas to play games and release in drib drabs every week 2 or 3 and 1 dead and 2 dead, and then lie about the dead that they're releasing. Enough is enough.
There's been suspicions that Benjamin Netanyahu never had any intention of agreeing to a second phase of the ceasefire deal, as it would involve pulling Israeli troops out of Gaza, whilst Hamas does, of course, remain. What do you make of this theory?
I don't think it's real, because we actually brought troops out of Gaza in order to have that deal. So the second phase just extends that. Why wouldn't Benjamin Netanyahu want to bring all his hostages home for extending the ceasefire? And also, as long as we extend the ceasefire, we have a chance of thinking about the future of Gaza and bringing in partners like the Saudis, like the Emiratis, like good faith actors like the Americans. This is only possible if Hamas don't continue to rule Gaza. And that's much better for the surrounding countries, and it's also much better for the people of Gaza.
Fleur Hassan-Nahoum, the former Deputy Mayor of Jerusalem and Foreign Ministry Special Envoy. Thank you for joining me this evening.
Thank you.
Let's hear from the other side and speak to Dr. Jamal Nazzal, a spokesperson for Fatah. Good evening to you, Dr. Jamal. The United Nations says there is intolerable suffering in Gaza amid deadly airstrikes and a continued aid blockade. Can you tell us more?
Well, the United Nations are right, but they have failed to prevent a genocide. What Israel is doing, it's sleepwalking into a human disaster. It is causing a human disaster and of an unprecedented proportions. What Israel is doing now is so dangerous. The world has seen nothing like this since World War II, and it is awful. The people lack the basic necessities of daily life. There is no electricity, hardly any water to drink. There is shortage of food. Israel has destroyed all schools, all universities, almost all hospitals, and all UN premises. So what are we talking about here? The world must cause Israel to respect the rules of conflict, to respect the necessity, the principle of military necessity, to respect the principle of proportionality. Israel has to provide evidence when it says it is targeting terrorists. Israel has to respect the human sanctity of life, which Israel is violating. I heard what the Israeli spokesman has said. It's really silly. She said all it takes to end the war is for Hamas to release the hostages. Well, look at what Israel is doing in the West Bank, destroying almost everything. There are no hostages in the West Bank. Look at what Israel is doing in Syria. Are there Israeli hostages in Syria to justify what Israel is doing there, bombing everything that moves in Syria? So we have a government in Israel which has a criminal mindset. They would never accept peace. They do not want peace because they are afraid of peace. Peace makes them fear that the Israeli society will break down from within. That's why this Israeli government needs conflicts and more conflicts. That is why Israel resumed Israel resumed attacking Gaza, because they don't want a solution to this crisis.
So earlier, as you just mentioned, I was speaking to Fleur Hassan-Nahoum, and she said right now this is a war that they didn't want, and they are pressuring Hamas with the latest strikes to get their hostages back. So my big question to you right now is, do you think that Israel and Hamas can go back to the negotiation table? And do you think there's any way out of this? Because what you said to me is Israel doesn't want peace.
Well, contrary to what she said, this is a war that Israel designed. Reports have proven that Israel's government was informed about the 7th of October, about the attack of October 7th, before it took place. It turned a blind eye to the warnings of the Israeli institutions, and it allowed it to happen. By the way, as a Fatah spokesman, we disapprove of October 7th. We disapprove of targeting civilians, be it on the hands of Hamas or in Israel. Yes, there is a way to end this. Hamas should have listened to the Arab Initiative. Hamas should have adhered to the decisions of the Arab Summit that took place in Cairo. The Arab states provided an alternative plan to Mr. Trump's plan of driving everybody out of Gaza. Hamas should have listened to what the Arab states have said. But that doesn't justify what Israel is doing. Because on the first day of resuming fire in Gaza, Israel killed 400 people. And the number is proven, not only by Hamas. Hamas is not the source we rely on. International institutions did provide the proof of the numbers, that the numbers of the casualties is true. And if Israel has doubts that the numbers are not accurate, it should allow international observers and journalists to enter Gaza to see by themselves what is taking place. There is an end to this conflict. Israel should cease fire. The mediators should resume their efforts. We should be given more time to look for a solution. There is a solution. The Arab state provide for the right platform, the right plan, the right vision led by Saudi Arabia and Egypt. We can find a solution, but Israel doesn't want one. Israel wants a conflict.
And earlier, obviously, when I was speaking to Fleur Hassan-Nahoum, she said that those death toll figures are not accurate, but you say that they are. So thank you for your point of view there. Israel said the return to fighting was fully coordinated with Washington. Now, could this be a tactic to get Hamas to agree to America's plans to transform Gaza?
No, this is a tactic to destroy Gaza, to destroy people, to destroy everybody and everything in Gaza. They want to make Gaza uninhabitable for Palestinians, and they want to drive them out of Gaza. What Israel is doing is not pressuring Hamas. Killing Palestinians is not an instrument of pressure in the eyes of Hamas. Hamas doesn't care about the number of Palestinians killed. It doesn't care about anything except remaining in power. Israel understands this, and it knows this all too well. What Israel wants is destroying Gaza, destroying the West Bank. If you wish, we can talk a little bit about the West Bank and what Israel is doing. It is terrifying the people here, blackmailing them, doing all sorts of collective punishment to everybody, despite the fact that there is no Hamas in the West Bank. There are no hostages. So They use all of this as a pretext. This is the classical Zionist talking points to justify killing civilians. This is a war against a defenseless population, be it in Gaza or in the West Bank.
Dr. Jamal Nazzal, spokesman for Fatah, thank you so much for joining me and bringing me your insights. Now let's take another look at some of the other stories making the headlines today. A federal judge has blocked Elon Musk and his Department of Government Efficiency from shutting down the U.S. Agency for International Development. U.S. District Judge Theodore Chang in Maryland said Musk's efforts to close the foreign aid agency violated the U.S. Constitution. Chang has ordered Musk to restore access to USAID's computer systems for employees, including those who were placed on leave. Canada and Europe could reconsider their interests in purchasing high-end U.S. weaponry as the Trump administration makes changes to U.S. foreign policy. President Trump has left NATO members questioning whether the U.S. would come to their aid if Europe was attacked by Russia. U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth previously told his European counterparts the United States could not make Europe's security their primary focus. South Korea's industry minister will visit Washington this week. He'll meet top officials to discuss concerns over being placed on watch list after the U.S. Department of Energy designated South Korea as a sensitive country. The acting U.S. ambassador in Seoul said that South Korea was added to the list because visitors to the Energy Department's labs mishandled some sensitive information. And NASA astronauts Butch Wilmore and Sunny Williams are doing great after landing back on Earth off the Florida coast yesterday. They spent more than 9 months in space after a mission that was only meant to last 8 days, and it suffered from technical issues. They've been checked over by a medical team before being reunited with their families. A Louisiana prisoner has been executed with nitrogen gas, the 5th person in the U.S. to be put to death using this very method. 46-year-old Jesse Hoffman Jr. had been found guilty of killing 28-year-old advertising executive Mary Molly Elliott in New Orleans. Hoffman was 18 at the time. Hoffman's lawyers had previously battled the Supreme Court, arguing nitrogen gas, which deprives a person of oxygen, violates the 8th Amendment prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. I'm now joined by human rights lawyer and founder of Justice League, Clive Stafford Smith. Clive, I really appreciate you joining me. Firstly, you actually knew Jesse Hoffman Jr. from your time in New Orleans. Tell us about his crimes and how he actually ended up in jail.
Yeah, well, I ran a charity in New Orleans for 11 years doing death penalty defense work, and he ended up in jail much like everyone in the U.S. does, which is that he had a very bad defense in a parish that was overwhelmingly white, and he was black. Look, there's no excusing the terrible thing he did. He killed a woman, but when you put it in perspective, he was 18 years old at the time. He came from an incredibly abusive background, and he just didn't get much of a defense. And then he spent 29 years waiting to be executed, by which time he was a very different human being.
As we mentioned, Hoffman's lawyers tried to argue against the use of nitrogen gas. Explain to us why this particular method was used over the lethal injection.
Well, that's a very good question. Lethal injection was offered back about 40 years ago as a kinder, gentler form of executing people. Turned out, and look, I've had to witness a couple of my clients being killed by it. It turns out it's just not true. The drugs that they used would take a terribly long time. So many of the people who were being injected had drug problems, and it was very, very hard to find a vein One time it took 40 minutes of them probing the guy with a needle to do it. So they had to come up with different ways. They ran out of those drugs in the end because drug companies didn't want their drugs being used to kill people. And they came up with this nitrogen suffocation, effectively. And it's a typical American story, which I say is an American, which is they copied a BBC television program by a guy called Michael Portillo, who was a British MP, who went around trying to figure out if there was a nice way of killing people and settled on this in a ridiculous television program. And that's why we now are trying this nitrogen hypoxia, which is basically just suffocating a human being in quite an unpleasant way.
Hoffman is not the only prisoner to be put to death this week. How many prisoners are currently awaiting execution on death row? And as you mentioned there, it does take a long time.
Well, it does. And in this 3-day period, there are 4 people who are going to be killed. There was Jesse Hoffman yesterday. Today, actually, it just should be happening very much this second in the US. Is the execution of Aaron Gunches, who's done 23 years on death row in Arizona. Tomorrow you've got Eddie James, who's done 30 years on Florida's death row, and tomorrow also Wendell Grissom, who's done 20 years on Oklahoma's death row. So there's a real spate of killing people going on in the US at the moment.
Clive, you have personally worked to overturn death sentences for convicts. You obviously spoke to us early about Jesse Hoffman Jr. My question to you is, do you really believe they can be reformed? And is the death penalty actually any deterrent?
Well, I mean, one of the things you have to take into account when you talk about reforming people is I'm in the middle of a process now to determine how many innocent people have been executed. And of the 1,615 to date, we're batting about a 13% average of getting the wrong person altogether. So we can't talk about reforming them if they didn't do it. And let's face it, one of the people I represented, Edward Earl Johnson, who was executed, I'm convinced was innocent. But then when you go beyond that, you look at Jesse Hoffman, he was 18 and he was a mixed up, abused kid when he was sent to death row. And he was in his 40s, almost 30 years later when we killed him. They're very, very different people, just not the same person. And deterrence is irrelevant. No one is deterred by the death penalty, least of all the 7 people who have held me up at gunpoint in New Orleans alone. That's just nonsense that politicians like Governor Landry spout to make up for the fact that they do nothing sensible to try and prevent the crime wave in the US.
Just whilst we have you, Clive, what's your take on the deportations currently taking place over in the US, the immigrants being taken to El Salvador? We've obviously seen the pictures of it happening, many of whom haven't actually been in front of a judge before they were put on these flights.
Well, I'm actually very sad about this as an American. I brought the very first case against Guantanamo Bay back in 2002. When we were hating Muslim people and saying everyone was terrorists. And, I finally got my last of 87 clients out of Guantanamo Bay in January when Trump starts using it for immigrants. And we're now vilifying immigrants as evil, horrendous terrorists. And this is just trampling on the American system in order to try again to spur hatred for a small group of people and pretend you're doing something when in fact all you're doing is sacrificing the essence of the country that we want to be. So it's very, very sad, but we are fighting to stop it, and I think we will.
Clive Stafford-Smith, human rights lawyer and founder of the Justice League, thank you for your insights this evening. Let's take a look at the top business news now. Pfizer has raised about $3.3 billion through the sale of its remaining 7.3% stake in Haleon, the maker of Sensodyne toothpaste. The drug maker has sold its entire stake to institutional investors and the consumer healthcare firm at 385 pence per share. Under the deal, Haleon has agreed to buy back 44 million shares from Pfizer, which is currently its largest shareholder. Google has agreed to pay $28 million to settle a lawsuit that claimed white and Asian employees were given better pay and also career opportunities than workers from ethnic backgrounds. That's according to a law firm representing claimants. The tech giant confirmed it had reached a resolution but rejected the allegations made against it. Turning to sports news now. Former tennis world number one Naomi Osaka says she wants to play with the big dogs again after battling to a 3-set win in the first round of the Miami Open. Osaka came from a set down to beat Ukraine's Yulia Strabodetska and claim her first victory since the Australian Open's second round in January. And the CEO of Formula One, Stefano Domenicali, has held a meeting with the Prime Minister of Thailand to discuss plans for a street circuit Grand Prix in Bangkok. The Thai leader says the government would commission a feasibility study into the possibility of a race in the capital from 2028. There is an existing track in Buriram in northeast Thailand, which is accredited by the World Motorsport governing body. A reminder of our top stories. Trump speaks to Zelensky on the phone as the US president says they are very much on track. It comes as Russia and Ukraine trade air attacks as Putin rejects America's proposal for a 30-day ceasefire. Israel launched a new limited ground invasion in Gaza as hundreds protest on the streets of Jerusalem. And a Louisiana inmate is executed with nitrogen gas, despite calls from his attorneys of it being an unconstitutional method. And that's all from us on W News. Thank you so much for joining us. Riz Khan is coming up next. And don't miss Tom Burgess-Watson with GNT. Good night and thank you.